For nearly 50 years, Graceland remained frozen in time, guarding the memory of one of the most famous men in history. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, had lived there, laughed there, and died there. His home had become a place of pilgrimage. Fans from around the world visited to get closer to the man whose voice had touched millions. But there was one part of the house no one had ever been allowed to enter: the attic. That attic door stayed locked for 48 long years. Dust settled thick on the steps, and even family members never dared to open it. But when it was finally unlocked in 2025, what they found stunned everyone. It wasn't just old furniture or forgotten costumes. It wasn't even another collection of guitars or gold records. Someone had been there. Someone had lived in the attic of Graceland. And what they left behind shook the Presley family to its core. For decades, the mystery of the attic loomed over Graceland like a shadow. Tour guides avoided the topic. Photographers weren't allowed upstairs. Even longtime employees didn't speak about what might be up there. The Presley family had been strict. Vernon Presley first locked it down. Later, Lisa Marie Presley continued the silence. Everyone accepted the official story. The upstairs, including Elvis's bedroom and attic, was private. It was said to be untouched since the day he died. But that explanation no longer satisfied fans, journalists, or even members of the staff. Rumors swirled. Some believed it was filled with priceless memorabilia. Others thought it might be empty. A few believed something darker was being hidden, but no one truly knew. What could possibly be so sensitive, so deeply personal, that it had to stay hidden for nearly half a century? Meanwhile, public interest in Elvis's final years only grew. The world still couldn't fully accept how he died. The official report, released in 1977, claimed he passed away from cardiac arrhythmia, but his physical condition and lifestyle told a more troubling story. Elvis was no longer the thin, energetic performer from the 1950s and 60s. By the late 70s, his health had worsened dramatically. He struggled with breathing, appeared exhausted on stage, and forgot lyrics to his own songs. Behind closed doors, the truth was darker. The autopsy report, which was kept from the public for years, revealed an enlarged heart, a swollen liver, and evidence of long-term damage from substance use. The toxicology report confirmed high levels of painkillers, sedatives, and other medications in his system. These were not accidental overdoses. These were prescribed drugs, and lots of them. All eyes turned to one man, Dr. George Nichopoulos, better known as Dr. Nick. Since 1967, he had been Elvis's personal physician. He was always nearby, always ready with pills. It wasn't just excessive, it was unbelievable. Dr. Nick had explanations for everything. He said Elvis had real health problems, back pain, eye issues, stomach inflammation. He claimed he was actually trying to manage the singer's dependency, not feed it. By supplying the medications himself, he said, he was keeping Elvis away from shady sources and illegal street drugs. He insisted that he was slowly trying to reduce the doses, but the public wasn't convinced. Neither were medical boards. In 1980, Dr. Nick was charged with overprescribing. He went to trial and was eventually found not guilty. But that didn't end the scrutiny. In 1995, the Tennessee Medical Board took his license permanently. It was a quiet but final judgment. The man who had treated the most famous musician in the world was no longer allowed to practice medicine. New theories continued to surface over the years. In 2020, a writer named Sally A. Hodel published a book titled Destined to Die Young. She argued that Elvis suffered from undiagnosed genetic conditions, including alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which affects the liver and lungs. According to her research, his health issues may have been inherited. His reliance on medication, she said, was not recreational. It was a desperate attempt to function through real pain. If she was right, then Elvis might not have been a reckless addict. He might have been a man struggling with undiagnosed disease in an era with little understanding of how to treat it. But while the world debated Elvis's death, his home remained a time capsule. And that attic, locked tight above the second floor, held secrets that no one could reach. Then came 2023. Lisa Marie Presley, the only child of Elvis, passed away suddenly at age 54. Her daughter, Riley Keough, became the new sole trustee of the Presley estate. It was Riley who inherited the responsibility of protecting Graceland. What she didn't know was that something was already in motion, something that threatened to take Graceland away from her entirely. In 2024, news broke that a company called Naussany Investments and Private Lending LLC had filed documents to foreclose on Graceland. According to their claim, Lisa Marie had taken a $3.8 million loan and used Graceland as collateral. The company presented legal papers that appeared to show Riley had failed to make payments, and that the property now belonged to them. They set an auction date. Within days, Graceland would be sold to the highest bidder. The reaction was instant and explosive. Fans were horrified. The idea of Elvis's home, his sanctuary, falling into unknown hands, sent shockwaves through Memphis and beyond. Online forums lit up with panic and theories. Could this be real? How could Riley let this happen? Was someone trying to steal Graceland? Riley's legal team moved fast. Her signature had been forged. The entire case was a scam. Just one day before the auction was scheduled to begin, the judge delivered his ruling. He sided with Riley. The sale was immediately halted. The judge called Graceland a one-of-a-kind cultural treasure and said its loss would be a blow to the public. Even more suspicious, no one from Naussany Investments showed up in court. They didn't defend their claim. They vanished. With the immediate crisis behind her, Riley made a decision that no one in her family had ever made. She agreed to open the attic. Archivists were called in. These were trained professionals in gloves and white coats, specialists in preserving historical artifacts. On a cold January morning in 2025, they climbed the staircase that led to the most secret part of Graceland. For the first time in 48 years, the attic would no longer be a mystery. The air was thick with dust. No one had touched the room since 1977. The only light came from a bare bulb swinging gently from the ceiling. The lock was old, made of brass. The key had remained in the Presley family since Elvis's death. The archivist turned it slowly. The door creaked open. What they saw inside shocked them. This wasn't just a storage room. It wasn't filled with junk or broken furniture. It was carefully arranged. It was organized. Someone had taken great care to preserve what was inside. The attic was larger than expected. It stretched across the entire top floor of the mansion. Thick curtains covered the dormer windows. The wooden floors were bare, but clean. A small air conditioner, unbelievably, was still running, maintained by Graceland staff who hadn't even known what it was cooling. Dozens of boxes lined the walls. Each one was labeled by hand. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Elvis's. Some boxes were marked Tupelo, 1945. Others read Army Days, Hollywood, Comeback Special, and Vegas. One box stood apart. It had a single word, after. The date on it, 1977. The archivists worked carefully. They documented each box before touching anything. Photographs were taken. Every item was cataloged. It would take months to go through the full collection. But some of the items stood out immediately. Inside the Tupelo box, they found a worn teddy bear. It had one missing eye and patches stitched in place. This wasn't a collectible. This was a child's toy. Family records later confirmed it was Elvis's childhood companion. His mother Gladys had sewn the patches from her own dresses. Another box held a Bible. Its pages were falling apart. The spine held together with electrical tape. It had belonged to Gladys. She had given it to Elvis when he entered the army in 1958. Her handwritten note inside urged him to stay faithful. One note read, "Keep singing, Elvis. You're going places." The discoveries told a story no one had ever heard before. It was the story of a man, not just a star. A man who saved memories. A man who organized his life into boxes, hoping someone might one day understand him. But the most emotional find came next. Inside a small, unlabeled box were several reels of tape. They were simple, unmarked, except for one. It read, "Practice, 1976." The reel, labeled Practice, 1976, was placed carefully onto an old tape player brought in by the archivists. The machine clicked. A low static hummed through the room. Then came the sound that froze everyone in place. Of Elvis's voice. Not the polished voice from his albums, not the commanding tone from sold-out Vegas shows. This was different. This was raw, personal, vulnerable. At first he mumbled softly, almost like he was talking to himself. Then he began to sing. No band, no backup, just him. The first song was a gospel tune, familiar but slow. Then he moved into something more bluesy. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. It was the emotion in his voice that struck everyone. It was as if Elvis was singing for no one but himself, testing out melodies and lyrics late at night, searching for something he couldn't find in the spotlight. Then came the most haunting piece of all, a stripped-down version of Unchained Melody. There were no instruments, just his voice. It cracked and trembled in places, but it carried so much feeling that some of the listeners had to wipe away tears. That recording was dated just months before he died. One expert would later describe it as Elvis saying goodbye in song. As the tapes played, the team grew more silent. These were not performances. These were confessions. Songs sung not for crowds, but perhaps for closure. More items followed, and each seemed to reveal another layer of the man who had once seemed larger than life. They found stacks of napkins, hotel stationery, and small notepads, all covered in handwritten lyrics. Some were unfinished. Others had alternative versions of famous songs. One note showed different lyrics to "Suspicious Minds" that never made it to the final recording. In the margins were tiny doodles, notes to himself, and underlined phrases. It offered a rare look into how Elvis crafted his songs. He wasn't just a performer, he was a thinker, a writer, a man chasing perfection. Among the papers was something even more unexpected, a letter addressed to no one. It had no envelope. The handwriting matched Elvis's, but it was more rushed, less careful. The letter was emotional. It spoke of feeling tired, feeling trapped. He wrote that the weight of his fame was suffocating. He mentioned wanting to escape, not from people. Tucked into the back corner of the attic, behind a stack of old luggage, they found something strange. It looked like a small storage closet, sealed tight. Inside, they discovered a worn sleeping bag, some canned food, and a few personal items. A comb, a pair of old glasses, and a photo of Elvis from the 1960s. For a moment, the team thought maybe it was just an emergency setup. But something didn't fit. The bedding was not from the 70s. It was newer. The food cans had expiration dates from the 1990s and early 2000s. Dust on the sleeping bag was light, not thick like the rest of the attic. Someone had been in there, and not long ago. This revelation shook everyone. For 48 years, the attic was believed to be sealed. But someone had found a way in, and someone had stayed. But who? Graceland security teams began to investigate. They reviewed decades of maintenance records, camera footage, and staff reports. It was discovered that in the late 1990s, during a period of quiet renovations, a section of the attic insulation had been replaced. A contractor who had once worked in the house was found, now retired. When questioned, he admitted he had found a small crawl space behind one of the upper vents that led into the attic. He never reported it. At the time, he didn't realize what it was. That tiny entrance had likely allowed someone to enter the attic without detection. But who would stay in the attic of Graceland? Why would they live in secret? A deeper search was ordered. Hidden inside the sleeping bag was a small notebook. Its pages were filled with notes. Some were diary-like entries. Others were just single words, strange sentences, or sketches. At first, it made no sense. But then, one of the pages caught their attention. It mentioned watching them walk below and hearing the tourists talk about Elvis like he was gone. This was no ordinary trespasser. This was someone obsessed. The notebook never revealed a name. It had no date, but the entries went on for years. Whoever wrote it had been living in the attic off and on since at least the early 2000s. They wrote about hiding when staff came close, about listening to audio tours, about watching documentaries about Elvis on a small battery-powered TV. They even mentioned moments when they cried listening to Elvis's final songs. Law enforcement was called. A full search of the attic and surrounding spaces was completed. Fingerprints were found. Eventually, a match was made. The man was identified as a former groundskeeper who had worked at Graceland in the late 1990s and early 2000s. He had developed an obsession with Elvis, believing that being close to the attic kept him connected to the spirit of the king. When his employment ended, he was never seen again. Family members thought he had disappeared. No one ever guessed where he had gone. Now it was clear. He had returned to Graceland and hidden in the attic. He lived quietly. It was unclear how long he had stayed, but the items left behind told the story of a man who found peace in the place where Elvis once lived and died. The Presley estate decided not to press charges. Instead, they handled the matter privately. They issued a statement saying the attic was now secured and would be carefully preserved as part of Graceland's legacy. But for many fans, the discovery changed how they viewed Elvis's home forever. It was no longer just a place of history. It had become a place of mystery. And that attic, once locked and forgotten, had turned out to be the most revealing room of all. After the shocking discovery that someone had lived inside Elvis Presley's attic, the world's attention turned once again to Graceland. The story made headlines around the world. News outlets covered every detail: the sealed attic, the tapes, the teddy bear, the notebook, and especially the man who had quietly lived above Elvis's resting place without anyone knowing. The Presley family, particularly Riley Keough, was placed under intense pressure. Reporters camped outside the gates, journalists begged for interviews, documentaries were planned. The public wanted to know more, and fans hoped that finally the truth about Elvis's life and his mysterious attic would be revealed in full. But Riley chose a different path. Instead of turning the discovery into a public spectacle, she asked the archivists to continue their work in private. She believed that Graceland wasn't just a museum, it was a home, her grandfather's home, and the things he left behind deserved to be handled with care, not turned into entertainment. Inside the attic, the team pressed forward. They had only begun to uncover what lay hidden. One by one, they opened the boxes Elvis had labeled himself. The section marked Hollywood revealed hundreds of photos, costume sketches, and production notes. Among them was a custom leather jacket made for Jailhouse Rock, with Elvis's initials stamped inside the collar. In the pocket was a small, folded piece of paper. Written in faded ink were just a few words: "Wear this when you want to disappear." The meaning was unclear, but it echoed what Elvis had often said during interviews, that he sometimes felt trapped by his image. The world saw the jumpsuits, the screaming fans, and the sold-out shows. But few saw the man who sat alone late at night, wondering who he was beneath it all. In another box marked Comeback Special, they found stage notes scribbled in red marker, song lists with arrows and stars, and letters from producers praising his performance. But beside all of that, they discovered a worn-out cassette tape in a plastic case. The label simply read, "Don't let them hear this." With caution, they played it. The tape began with silence, then Elvis's voice again. Not singing this time, speaking. The way his life had been managed, scheduled, sold. He said he felt more like a product than a person. "People think I'm made of glitter and gold," he said, "but I bleed just like everybody else." He spoke about Priscilla, about Lisa Marie, about the days when music still felt like fun, and about the nights when he couldn't sleep unless someone handed him a handful of pills. His words were slow, heavy, and thoughtful. It sounded like a man unburdening himself, knowing he might not get another chance. At the end of the tape, his voice cracked. "If anything happens to me," he said, "tell them I tried." No one spoke when the recording ended. Even the most experienced archivists, people who had worked in museums for decades, sat in silence. They knew they had heard something that few people ever would. A man stripped of fame, speaking his truth into a microphone. In the days that followed, more items surfaced. In the Vegas section, they found receipts from hotels, stage props, and a pile of fan mail. Some of the letters had never been opened. One envelope was postmarked from 1976 and was sent by a soldier stationed overseas. Inside, the letter thanked Elvis for giving him hope through hard times. It ended with a plea. "Please take care of yourself. We need you alive." Another box contained scrapbooks filled by Elvis himself. He had pasted newspaper clippings, circled headlines, and written comments in the margins. It was clear that he read everything said about him, both good and bad. He reacted to the praise with humility, but the criticism seemed to cut deep. In one corner, beside a headline that read, "Is Elvis finished?" he had written just 2 words, "Not yet." One of the last discoveries was a collection of books. They were not what people expected. There were no flashy biographies or music manuals. Instead, they were about spirituality, life after death, and Eastern philosophy. Books with titles like The Way of the Soul and Eternal Questions. Many were underlined. Notes filled the margins. Questions were written in the back pages. Where do we go? What if I come back? Does music survive the body? These notes painted a new picture of Elvis, not just as a musician, not just as a legend, but as a man looking for answers. Someone trying to understand his place in the world and what came after. As the weeks passed, the archivists began the process of preserving everything. Each item was cleaned, scanned, and sealed in temperature-controlled storage. Riley Keough made a quiet announcement. Some of the items, she said, would eventually be displayed in a new wing of the Graceland Museum. But others, she explained, were too personal. They would remain in the Presley family's private care. Visitors to Graceland now walk past a new sign at the base of the stairs. It reads, "Upstairs and attic, private." But next to it, in smaller writing, are the words, "In memory of the man behind the music." No tourists will ever see the attic for themselves, but they will know that it held the pieces of a man who changed the world, even as he struggled with his own. And as the attic door closed once again, this time with care, not secrecy, it marked the end of a chapter, not of Elvis Presley's legend, but of his mystery. As word spread about the attic's contents, reactions from around the world poured in. Musicians, historians, fans, and celebrities responded with emotion and respect. For many, this new insight into Elvis Presley's private life was more powerful than any gold record or sold-out concert. The man behind the voice had finally been revealed, not in a stage spotlight, but in a quiet, dusty room he had once filled with memories. Graceland received thousands of letters. Some came from elderly fans who remembered seeing Elvis perform live. Others came from young people who had only known him through stories and songs. Many wrote about how the attic discoveries made them feel connected to Elvis in a way they never had before. They spoke of the teddy bear, the Bible, the handwritten lyrics, and especially the tape where Elvis said, "Tell them I tried." Those words resonated with millions. The Presley family, overwhelmed by the public's compassion, decided to release a short documentary. It would not be a dramatic exposé or a flashy biography. Instead, it would be a quiet, respectful presentation of the attic's contents. Titled The Room Above, the documentary premiered online and received worldwide attention. It showed the attic as it had first appeared, dim, solemn, and still. The camera lingered on the boxes, the tapes, the childhood bear. Then it played audio clips from the uncovered recordings. The most powerful moment came near the end, when the stripped-down version of Unchained Melody played over slow shots of the attic. Viewers listened to the shaky but soulful voice of Elvis, singing alone in a space that had been hidden for half a century. Many who watched said it was the most moving performance of his entire life. Following the documentary's release, museums around the country requested permission to borrow some of the attic items. The Presley estate declined. Riley Keough insisted that Graceland was the only place where these memories belonged. She announced that a new exhibition space would be built, called the Private Archives. It would open in 2026 and display selected items from the attic to the public for the first time. Meanwhile, security at Graceland was quietly updated. The attic's entrance was reinforced. Surveillance was added throughout the second floor, based on his age and condition of the items left behind. His identity was never publicly confirmed. Out of respect, the Presley family requested privacy regarding his name and motives. They believed that whatever pain had brought him to hide in the attic should not be turned into headlines. Instead, they chose to focus on the deeper meaning of what had been found. For Elvis fans, the attic discoveries became a turning point. Over the years, countless stories had tried to define him, some celebrated, others critical, many simply speculative. But the attic showed something those stories never could: the heart of the man himself. Elvis had saved things no one knew he still had. A patched teddy bear from his childhood, letters from fans, his mother's Bible, scribbled lyrics and quiet recordings. These were not the possessions of a man obsessed with fame. They were the tokens of someone who still remembered where he came from, even after becoming the most famous man in the world. And the short, rushed, emotional letter said everything. "If anything happens to me, tell them I tried." It wasn't a complaint, it wasn't a goodbye, it was a reminder that behind the jumpsuits, behind the screaming crowds and Vegas lights, was a person. A man who carried pressure, expectations, and personal demons. A man who wanted to do better. A man who tried. In the months that followed, visitors to Graceland increased. Some came with flowers, others came in quiet reflection. They didn't just want to see where Elvis lived. They wanted to feel closer to the man who had written songs in notebooks, prayed with his mother's Bible, and cried while singing alone. The attic became something spiritual. Though the public couldn't enter it, they understood its importance. It had become, in its own way, the soul of Graceland. For Riley Keough, the attic changed how she viewed her grandfather. She had grown up knowing him as a legend, but now she understood him as a man. She spoke about it publicly only once, saying, "I think he wanted us to find it. Not right away, but eventually, when the time was right." And maybe that's what Elvis wanted all along. Not to be remembered as an icon, but as someone real. As someone who made mistakes, asked questions, and tried right up to the end. Now, Graceland carries two legacies. One is for the world, the music, the performances, the legend of the king of rock and roll. The other is for those who go deeper. The attic, the recordings, the small personal treasures left behind. Elvis Presley's story didn't end in 1977. It continued in silence, high above the rooms where the world had once cheered for him. And when the attic door finally opened after 48 years, it didn't just reveal secrets, it gave the world something greater. It gave them the truth.